Hello everyone and welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video. And in today's Kerbal Space Program video, we're going to be focusing on the construction and flight of a gigantic space station. When I set out to construct this space station, I initially set out to make it a refueling base for low Kerbal in orbit, and as you will see over the next however many minutes this video ends up being, I kind of got a little bit carried away. I ended up making it what I consider the ultimate in terms of Kerbal space stations. It's going to have not only, the capacity to refuel ships, it's going to have all of the capacity to refuel ships. It has an absolutely ludicrous amount of fuel on board. Further to this, it also has a massive crew capacity. It has not only lots and lots of crew cabins in the main core of the space station, but it also has two gigantic rotating artificial gravity rings using the stock pieces from the Breaking Ground DLC. And here you can see me placing the symmetry exploit in order to make those big round rings. You can see me doing it here. It's how I'm able to get 64-way symmetry to create the rings. I'll do a quick summary of how that was done, just in case you've not seen any videos I've done previously explaining how it works. I basically placed 8-way symmetry. I placed 8-way symmetrically placed cubic octagonal struts around the rotor. I then placed another strut at the end of the craft and added 8-way symmetrically placed struts to that. And then I took the single strut with the 8 struts around it, are you following so far, and attached it via 8-way symmetry to the struts placed around the rotor itself. So then we ended up with 2 layers of struts effectively. We had the 8 struts placed symmetrically around the rotor, each of which having 8 struts attached to them. We then had to take one of the 64 peripherally placed struts and attach them to the rotor, and then for whatever reason at that point the game sees them as having 64-way symmetry rather than 8-way symmetry. So instead of placing 8 around the rotor, it places 64. And that's how I was easily able to create those 64-way symmetrically placed cubic octagonal struts. This is all really difficult to say. Struts. I keep wanting to say structs for some reason. Regardless, that's what I was doing there. Inside those fairing pieces, we've got those rotors with the 64-way symmetry inside them. We'll construct the artificial gravity rings at a later point in the build. For now, I just wanted to focus on the actual core of the space station itself. And my actual, visual muse for the appearance of this space station was, I find that whenever I see a TV show, like a sci-fi show like Star Trek or Doctor Who, a lot of the space stations have this very similar appearance where there's this big disc structure towards the top of the space station and then down towards the bottom of the space station. And when I'm talking about bottom and top, by the way, imagine it's being placed radially in to a planet. So the bottom of the space station would be towards the planet, and the top of the space station would be the furthest point away from the planet. Generally, that's what I mean. It starts out as this big sort of UFO ring structure at the top, and then it sort of tapers down to a point at the bottom, and the very bottom contains lots of satellite dishes and communications equipment, which you can see is what I'm doing here. I hope all of this made sense. I'm kind of getting a bit... It's very, very warm in my room, and I'm recording this on a Friday. I'm basically recording this on my bank holiday day because, again, work has been very busy this week, but we all got a day off on Friday, so I've had to spend the entire day trying to throw this video together. I thought I'd try and do something nice and simple to make sure I definitely had, I had enough time to make the video and do all the editing. As you can see, the space station ended up becoming this massive, gigantic monstrosity. So I ended up really cutting it fine how much time I had left to make it. So I did get a bit carried away. And to be honest, guys, this video is going to be a little bit bittersweet. Things went very, very wrong in the flight. The Kraken ended up completely obliterating a huge proportion of this mission, and it got to the point where literally I just completely lost the will to live, and I'm like, you know what, I just don't need this stress in my life. You will see things as they transpire, but this space station, it looks really, really nice from a visual standpoint and aesthetically, and the actual design of the ship I really, really like, and obviously it gets into orbit and it works really well, but it's completely impossible to actually use. It'll be a nice ornament, but it's not going to be usable, unfortunately. And it's a shame, because there was a reason for me to want to make a refueling station in low Kerbal orbit. I have an idea for a future video that will necessitate having a refueling space station in low Kerbal orbit. I guess this is just not it. We're going to have to build another one, a more simple one at some point, or maybe we'll just doing a video where we extend one of my existing space stations in low Kerbal orbit and make it a little bit more functional from the standpoint of having the ability to refuel things. Anyway, this is it. This is the space station so far. I have it on the launch pad with gravity turned to the lowest setting, obviously, so it doesn't just collapse. I just wanted to have a look at how things looked with it in its final form. And I thought, you know what? You guys probably want to see it with the gravity turned on suddenly. And that's it there falling down. I had to speed up the footage a fair amount. Just to obviously, I guess you guys are probably familiar with how things crash in Kerbal Space Program at this point. If you're not, you're obviously not playing Kerbal Space Program correctly, but we'll just show it crashing there. So that's, ironically, the easy part of the mission. Now we need to actually figure out how to get this thing into space. And ideally, as simple a rocket as possible, because this is a very, very big craft, and the Kraken loves destroying complicated ships. And getting something as massive as this into orbit is going to take a very, very big ship. And the bigger the ship, the more susceptible it is to Kraken attacks, as I learned the hard way with this very space station, in fact. But I thought, let's try and make it simple. We'll keep it a single stage rocket that gets it into orbit. That way we're minimizing any risk of things falling apart or splitting or destaging wrongly throughout the flight. I did want to add one more thing, though, which you can see me adding here. This is an escape shuttle. A bit like the Dream Chaser was my initial muse, though obviously this is much, much bigger in scale than the Dream Chaser. Basically, if something happens and the crew need to evacuate quickly, we have 2 of these shuttles docked to the side of one of the crew cabins of the space station. These have capacity for 4, 8, 12, 14 Kerbals each, so there's 28 in total to get the crew off. So the crew capacity for this station is 28, and here you can see we're doing a little test to make sure they can actually glide and don't just nose down into the ground. I didn't do a great job of getting it back onto the runway, but I wasn't too bothered because this is only a test after all. And as you can see, it touched down fine. If anything, it's quite a good way of making sure these things are definitely safe. In case something happens during the deorbit that means that we don't actually get anywhere close to the runway, we now know that they can land on grass nice and safely. And now we can add them to the side of the space station via these docking ports. These will be the escape pod vessels of the craft. I think I just experimented with having more than just 2, but the wings would have clipped together. I guess I could have added a couple more at a slightly different position so that the wings wouldn't touch, but I think at this point, 28 Kerbals on this space station, it's probably, you don't want to have it too crowded, like it looks like it's big, but with 28 people on board, it's going to feel pretty cozy pretty quickly. Anyway, now we're going to add the nuclear power plant, which is just loads and loads of RTGs stuffed into a service bay, and that will provide this space station with lots and lots of power. But to help, complement the power provided by those RTGs, we can add some solar panels, because it's nice, first of all, to have a backup in case the primary power source fails. But more importantly, the solar panels look a lot more spaceshipy and science-y. And that's the main reason why it's very important to have solar panels on your space stations in Kerbal Space Program. And I thought I'd use the fuel tanks there just to form the arm of it. Of course, draining them of their fuel just to, make them weight efficient. And speaking of draining fuel, you may have noticed all the actual fuel reserves, these big orange tanks here, and indeed the central core that they're attached to, would normally be filled with fuel, but they are completely empty. And that's just to help facilitate our flight into space. As you can see, this thing already has a very, very big dry mass. It's going to be very, very hard to get into orbit as it is. And if those fuel tanks were full of fuel, it would be nigh on impossible without an absolutely ludicrous booster that will probably shake itself to death by the Kraken long before it gets anywhere close to low Kerbin orbit. So we're going to be doing 2 launches here. We're going to be launching the space station itself without the onboard fuel using this thing that you can see me constructing here. And then we will do another launch that will put the crew on board the ship, and crucially, it will refill all of the fuel tanks on board. And that's the mission that doesn't go quite to plan, but you'll see how things transpire as the video progresses. Here you can see me just strutting this thing to high heaven. I guess it's not that realistic because I'm using the offset tool to get those tanks into a hovering position. I guess the ideal way of getting around needing to do this unrealistic use of the offset tool and the strut is to use the auto strut feature of Kerbal Space Program, but it is so glitchy, the auto strut feature that it's literally not even worth using in the vast majority of use cases, because the ship will just, I don't know what it is, if the parts collide with each other and the game doesn't know how to calculate the physics, they just end up, and I'm sure most of you have encountered this if you play Kerbal Space Program yourselves, because why are you watching this video if you don't? But you'll probably have encountered this at some point where ships just shake themselves to pieces. That's just because of auto strut playing up. So I'm trying to use real struts. Is that the equivalent of auto strut, but with the actual strut pieces whenever I can? So that's how I made sure this thing would stay nice and together. It's very important that for the rings, that the struts that hold the rings together are all attached to pieces that will will be separated from the vessel. Because once you fire up that rotor, if there are any struts connecting the actual spinning piece to the core of the station, the strut will stop it from spinning. It's not like a decoupler or a docking port or anything where once the decoupler is decoupled or the docking port is undocked, the strut will disappear. That's not the case for rotors. The strut will always be there. So that's why I've had to add all of those little expendable little fuel tanks just to provide an anchor point for those rotating rings, but the anchor point can be detached once we get into orbit and we want those rings freely spinning. By the way, you may notice we are now well on our way into space. And it is an absolutely ridiculous craft. It is a single stage to orbit as well, which adds to the ridiculousness of it. And I am playing back this footage very, very quickly. I mean, the real time, it literally took, I don't actually know how long it took literally, but it took a very long time to get this thing into space. So I've sped this up. You're watching the footage back at 4 times normal speed. I can technically make it play back a little bit faster in Sony Vegas, but in Sony Vegas, if you speed up footage more than 4 times normal speed, it starts causing things like the audio to desync, and it can just be a little bit glitchy sometimes when playing back. So I'm going to keep it at 4 times speed just so you can have the nice, wonderful, clear audio of those engines just firing, which, now I say it out loud, it's not the nicest sound to hear. It's not like a song, or like there's no voices in this game, but regardless, I think it's nice just to be able to hear that satisfying clunk of the decoupler as the lower stages detach. One thing that I didn't feature in the time-lapse, not deliberately, I just noticed, I think I made this tweak after I stopped recording because I realized that this is a single stage to orbit, and once we decouple those boosters, they're just going to leave huge amounts of clutter in space. So I've actually, this is kind of cheaty I guess, but inside those nose cones I've clipped a small probe core as well as an RTG and a very small SAS unit, just so those boosters can deorbit themselves. Don't worry, I'm not going to show the footage of me doing that because that would take absolutely ages to do, because there's 8 of them, I think. Is there 8? There's 8 of them, and it'll be very boring to watch, and I feel like I've already spending long enough showing you the launch of this craft. This is only the first craft we're launching in this mission. The second craft will actually be, ironically, was much, much harder to do. Like the second rocket, even though the payload was a bit more sensible, like it wasn't this gigantic, monolithic, unaerodynamic space station, it was a very, very heavy payload. A heavier payload than this, because we had to get, I think it was something like 23,000 units of liquid fuel, and however many oxidizer you need for that ratio into space. So that was very, well, you're going to watch it in a second, so I'm not going to hype it up too much, but yeah, there we are. We are now on our way into space. Now, we had to take a very, very steep ascent profile here. Again, you may notice it's not a very aerodynamic structure. And when I tried doing a quote-unquote normal gravity turn, like where you gradually arc it over on your way to space, you end up not having to do a massive burn at apoapsis, the thing would either just shake itself to pieces or just succumb to aerodynamic forces, or just it would like break in half in the middle. It didn't quite work. So I had to go with a very inefficient, steep trajectory just to make sure that we would definitely get it into space. But don't worry, we have enough fuel reserves, as you can see, so it wasn't really an issue, though. I had to fly things slightly less efficiently than I might have otherwise wanted to if we had, a sensible payload, which we don't. I mean, I guess I could have really gone above and beyond and tried to make the rings unfold themselves with rotors and stuff, like I've seen a couple of people do on the subreddit, but at this point, it was already becoming a very, very complex ship, and it was very, very prone to Kraken attacks as is. I didn't want to further complicate the structure with more rotating parts, aka more Kraken bait, so I decided to just leave it as it was. I'm actually crossfading a little bit here just to show you how I got into its final orbit, just because, again, this thing turns about as fast as a merry-go-round that is broken. It is very, very, very slow to turn, so I just decided to just crossfade across to all the actual burns, showing you how I got it into orbit, and there it is. Speaking of orbit, we are now safely in orbit. Those are the rings turning nicely there. I have sped the footage up a bit, so it's not just like watching a PowerPoint presentation, so it might not have been spinning at a very realistic speed for you. That's just because I had to speed the footage up. Anyway, now we're on mission 2 of 2 for this little space station odyssey. We're going to be building the refueling craft. And this is it here. All of these fuel tanks, they have to be completely full when it comes to getting to the space station, because this is the amount of fuel we're going to need to fill up all of the refueling tanks. And obviously we've got that crew cabin at the very top, which is a very big piece in and of itself, but it's completely dwarfed by the refueling bit underneath it. So this is what we need to get to the space station. That adapter piece with the skipper engines attached to it, that's going to be the only fuel source for this upper stage. So we're going to need a pretty hefty booster to get this thing close to the space station before we can switch over to those skipper engines. So this is how I'm going to construct it. Again, it's going to be an SSTO just to minimize the amount of complications and minimize the susceptibility of Kraken attacks for the rocket. So I'm constructing it here, and I guess it's a bit cheaty. I am using I'm not using part clipping, but the engines are clipping together, and I guess so are the fuel tanks a little bit as well. And because there is some clipping involved, I can't really use the auto strut, because auto strut is especially prone to creating, attacks where the craft shakes itself to pieces when there is any kind of clipping involved. So I'm going to have to use, again, the quote-unquote real struts to keep this thing together, rather than being able to rely on the auto strut. Oh, sorry, I've just had to pause the commentary just then to get a glass of water, because I realised I was just choking up just then. It is, and I've just walked back into my room and realised just how warm my office has become. We've had some pretty stunning weather. Not that we're able to really make much use of it, given the current situation worldwide. But, it's meant that the room is very, very hot. And given that I have a soundproofed office and it's very small as it is, it's getting pretty toasty in here. I think I just dehydrated myself by talking to you. It's not to you, it's more at you, isn't it? It's not really a conversation. I'm very selfish like that, you see. Anyway, here is the craft launching. So, I mean, again, this is a great example of just how big those Saturn V parts from the Making History DLC are. Like, they completely dwarf those peripherally mounted orange tanks, which were formerly the biggest parts in Kerbal Space Program before the Making History DLC was added. And again, not quite as steep as before, but we're still going to have to go for a fairly steep ascent profile for this rocket here. And this rocket was very, very, very Kraken attack happy. This was probably like the 5th or the 6th launch that you're watching here. And so I got to the point where I was getting so frustrated launching this rocket again and again, and it flies very, very slow. Again, this footage is played back at 4 times normal speed. I'm going to give you an example of one of the failed flights. It just went blowed up. So I thought, you know what, let's just make quick saves during the ascent. So if you ever see a cut now, it's because it blew up and I just reloaded a quick save. So I don't really have one continuous launch anymore. It's just a launch and a quick save, then it blew up, so I reverted back to the most recent quick save. That's how I kind of nursed this thing into orbit. I think I finally diagnosed the problem as something to do with the Mammoth engines. I'm not sure what it specifically was, because I don't think they're actually clipping into anything, though maybe they are. But I think it was those, because I got to the point where I was trying to circularize and it just kept on blowing up again and again and again and again. So I think by shutting down the Mammoth engines, I managed to resolve the problem. So, by the way, I'm not putting any of these craft in the description, because, my God, don't do this to yourself, guys. Like, this is the part, I said this video is kind of bittersweet. It's going to be what happens now. So what I'm doing currently is I'm trying to get our encounter with the space station. So I'm noticing on the map screen that our target is currently behind us, which means we need to enter a slower orbit to get a nice close encounter. So I'm going to first of all raise our apoapsis to be above the orbital height of the main space station. That should give it enough time to catch up with us, and then we can rendezvous and dock. So I'm about to perform the circularization burn, and as you can see, Kraken decided, nope. Luckily, I was kind of used to making ample quick saves at this point, so I'm just going to reload a previous quick save and we can perform that circularization burn and get ourselves into a stable orbit. Oh! Maybe I spoke too soon. Remember when I said that it probably seemed to be the Mammoth engines causing the glitches? So I decided to then disable the Mammoth engines, and I managed to just about get into orbit without this thing blowing itself up. So, I don't know if we've learned anything. But what I then learned was that all of this was futile anyway, because I got to the space station and this is what was happening. Like, I don't know if it was because when I just switched to the space station or, reload a save of the station in orbit before I did the refueling mission, everything was fine. I think it's just having these two massive craft next to each other. It just didn't like it, and the game can't seem to calculate the physics right. So I tried getting a Kerbal just on EVA. I had just used the rendezvous cheat just to get a Kerbal, which is obviously the smallest thing you can possibly send into space. near the space station, and that again just caused it to glitch out. For whatever reason, the game can't seem to simulate this space station and another craft within the same physics area. So this shot here is what you're left with, I'm afraid. It's this space station just, floating serenely in orbit around Kerbin, but that's all it can ever be, unfortunately. I mean, if you guys know of any solutions to this, then I will gladly listen, but I feel like this is it. Unfortunately, craft of this size, I think, just aren't really feasible in Kerbal Space Program. Now, in Kerbal Space Program 2, it looks like we can build space stations of this magnitude. So maybe, we can put a pin in this. We could save this design for a later date and say, let's do it again. But I'm really sorry, guys. With YouTube, you have to keep a weekly upload schedule whenever possible. And I'd spent like 8 hours at this point on making this video. I didn't really want to make it go to waste. And I feel like it's still an all right thing for you to see, because you watch the rocket. You can see the construction of this thing, first of all. You saw how I got it into orbit using a ridiculous single stage to orbit, and that was all done like legit, and it all worked. So I feel like there is something here. I feel like there was still something worth showing you guys, and that's what you're seeing on the screen here. So I hope you liked it. It was a slightly different change of pace of video, and like I say, kind of bittersweet, but still, looking at it now, I think it does look pretty nice, although I am seeing it starting to wobble a little bit now. So let's quickly speed up and go to an end screen. On the left-hand side is a link to a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm. On the right-hand side is my most recent upload. There's also a link to check out my Patreon and to subscribe if you would like to. And in the description, you'll find links to Twitter, Instagram, Discord, all the good stuff. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.